The cattle feeding industry really has a long and very colored history, and it starts out with the terminal markets and the cattle drives, which goes clear back into the 1800s. But as we moved into the 1900s, the early part of the 1900s, those terminal markets were still very important collection points, because for a long period of time and into the 1900s, we still did a lot of shipping of cattle by rail. And so those former cattle drive collection points became very significant in terms of collection of cattle, aggregation of cattle, and shipping of cattle back to Chicago and places where the packing plants were closer to the population centers where they could sell the beef. Of course, early on, refrigeration was not so widely available, and so being closer to the consumer was very important. But as we went further into the 1900s, and as irrigation came about, and as refrigeration came about, as interstate highway systems became established and just better highway systems became established, the cattle feeding business was not only growing, but it was moving into the plains like eastern Colorado, like western Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, and even more so into areas just west of where the cattle had traditionally been fed. Colorado is rich in history in the cattle feeding business, and it's actually one of the earliest places where cattle were fed a high concentrate grain ration and to scale. W.D. Farr and the Montfort family are really two names that everybody that knows about the cattle feeding business in Colorado is familiar with. They observed with the seasonality of the business that consumers needed a 12-month supply of beef. They needed beef to be supplied every week, every month, all the time. And that was something back when the industry was a grass-based industry, it just was not available because of the seasonality of forage production. But putting cattle in confinement and feeding them grain, like we do today, not only produced a very high quality, highly palatable product, but it also ensured a year-round supply of that beef. The Cuner feed yard where we're standing today was built in 1971. So it's 40 years old. Although this yard is older, it's been completely redone. So today it's one of the most modern feed yards that you'll find anywhere in the industry. There's 95,000 cattle on feed here today, so it's about 100,000 head capacity feed yard. So it's a large operation, it's a very efficient operation. It's in a good location relative to feed supplies. There's a lot of silage grown in this area. There's a lot of corn in this area, and so that's beneficial from accessing feed resources. You know, a lot of people don't realize that the cattle feeding industry has a high economic multiplier effect, and in fact, it's about a 6-to-1. Studies have been done in the past that would show that for every dollar spent in a feedlot, there's about $6 of additional economic activity that are generated in the community, and even and more broadly than that, to support those activities. And of course, that comes from growing the grain, to all of the other feed ingredients, the forages, to the employment, to the people that work here. Feed yards have a sizable staff, and so there's people, there's jobs created at a feed yard because of that, and there is a very significant impact on the local economy. The future of cattle feeding in Colorado, I think, is very bright. Now, we're not going to see as many small feed yards along the Front Range as we have in the past. I mean, that's pretty much a given because we've already seen a big change. There just are not going to be because of the urban sprawl in this area. But I think what we're going to see is we're going to see cattle feeding continue to grow in the eastern plains of Colorado. So we'll replace some of those smaller yards with other yards further east, because Colorado still has some resources in terms of feed. It has packing capacity, has significant packing capacity, and so there is a need for cattle to continue to be fed in Colorado.